Welcome to We Love TTRPGs. I'm your host, Adam, and this video is packed with useful advice and guidance for those new to tabletop role-playing games. I made this video to encourage everyone new to this fabulous hobby of TTRPGs, specifically game masters. And though we have a lot of information to discuss, let's begin with letting you know I'm worried about you. No, wait, that doesn't sound right. I mean, I'm concerned for you. I'm concerned that you might be feeling overwhelmed. When I began DMing, all I had to learn was a 32-page adventure like these, which back then were called modules, because they were intended to be modular, meaning you could plop them down in your existing game with very simple tweaks. The very first long campaign I ever ran began with 1985's The Temple of Elemental Evil. Now, I had been playing and DMing for 5 years at that point, so the length of this wasn't a drawback, and the entire adventure is a pretty straightforward mega dungeon. I mean, there are some politics, world building, and other elements more common to modern gaming, but those aspects were so trivial, you might blink and miss them. This 128-page Temple of Elemental Evil was only the second super module ever published by TSR, with the first coming just a month earlier in Lankmar City of Adventures. The idea of such a long adventure was very new and unique at the time. They later followed it up with Scourge of the Slave Lords and Queen of the Spiders, both of which were anthologies of previously released modules. Now combined in a single book, the modules were given some additional material that attempted to tie them together more clearly than individual releases had accomplished. Looking back at the individual modules, the introduction of super modules, and thinking about the size of current WotC hardbound adventures, I have to wonder if the larger books might be creating a barrier to new players. If I had not been able to learn D&D through small bite-sized pieces, what effect might that have had on me? With the brevity of those modules, you could be finished in a night or two of gameplay, and the story was still whatever my players, my skill level, and my whimsy found best for our table at the time. And they inspired individual creativity. They didn't give you all the answers. That was up to each DM to flesh out. And I gotta say, that's a very pleasing and flexible way to learn the hobby. But now, holy catableepus, you need to learn a 250-page hardbound book where everything at the end depends on everything in the beginning unfolding and concluding in a specific way. And too bad if your players aren't enjoying themselves. You still gotta grind through 200 pages of material or just abandon the whole thing. You know what? No part of that sounds fun to me. I'm aware of the starter sets, I'm sure we all are, but there's not much material in the middle range to act as a bridge for new players. Are those 250-page hardbound books that attempt to detail every single NPC, every single plot detail, and the bathroom habits of every single monster really the best way for new DMs and players to learn TTRPGs? From my perspective, I'm going to assume no. So we'll be talking about that and what I recommend doing instead. But even without those big adventure books, the hobby has advanced so much in the past 50 years. There's a lot to learn. And with some of the most successful streamers like Critical Role creating unrealistic and incorrect expectations among new players, this can all seem more like the punishment of Sisyphus than a fun hobby. For clarity, in Greek mythology, Sisyphus was forced to push a boulder up a hill every day for eternity. And the closer he was at the top, the larger that boulder grew, only to roll back down. I think that really creates a mental image of what it must be like for those new to the hobby. Just when you think you figured it all out, bam, something new to learn. And that's absolutely true, but that's not anything to be afraid of. This is also an exciting time to be playing. You've got so many of us weirdos on YouTube offering advice, and the fan base is so big now. There are countless books and other resources to support hobbyists of every skill level. And so long as you avoid the toxic waste dump that is Reddit, you have a plethora of helpful information to fall back on. Yet as helpful as all the advice and supporting material is meant to be, it too could have an unintentional side effect of making it seem like the barriers to entry are really high. Do you know what the real difference is between a new dungeon master and an experienced one? Are you somehow playing a lesser game with an inexperienced DM as opposed to a super experienced veteran one? From beginner to expert, those two and thus the results might be closer than you think. The desired result is to enjoy ourselves. It doesn't require any prior experience to achieve that. A group of new players might be participating in a different type of game than experienced ones, but neither is less than or greater than the other. Just different. This is Castle Amber. When I ran this back in the early 80s, we had a great time. I enjoy the premise and the backstory of this adventure so much that I decided to run it again for my current Sunday group. I highly recommend the 5th edition Goodman Games version. Over the past couple of months, I've been able to use this with some creative world building of my own. But when I ran the original as a teenager, it was just another dungeon crawl. There was almost no difference in the personalities of the different Amber family members found in Part 1. They were all just combat encounters, and the mansion was just a big, weird dungeon. Then in Part 2, it was the same thing. Get from place A to place B, fight something, get your reward, and so on. Rinse and repeat. Part 3 was no different, just combat encounter after combat encounter. And all of that was fine because we had fun. Sure, the NPCs might have had some slight attempt at individual personalities. I mean, I tried. And combat still required something close to intelligent tactics, but it was all still pretty much run like a dungeon crawl, like any other. That's because nearly every adventure back then was a dungeon crawl, even if the scenery was slightly different. So when I ran Castle Amber in the 80s, I treated it like every other published module. And if that's how you play adventures today, that's perfectly fine. D&D streamers aren't likely to play that way only because it wouldn't be fun to watch, but it's a perfectly legitimate style of play. In fact, many players prefer combat encounters to other aspects of the game. And remember, someone who loves role-playing over combat is no less or more of a valuable player than one with a different preferred playing style. Castle Amber is based on stories written by Ashton Clark Smith. Fast forward 40 years, and while prepping to run this again, I was able to listen to all of his stories on audiobooks. This has allowed me to develop the adventure in ways that were just not possible in the 80s. With what I know now, it has the appropriate elements of gothic and cosmic horror the adventure was always meant to evoke. I've been able to take ideas introduced into stories, add those already provided in the adventure, and indulge my own fantasies of what might happen to a Catholic province of France during the Inquisition if it had been consumed and transported to Ravenloft's Domains of Dread. This is GW1, Legion of Gold from 1981. I loved this back in the early 80s, and I ran it many times. But I ran it just like I ran Castle Amber. It was some loosely connected combat encounters setting up a final confrontation that had little to no development throughout the course of previous encounters. And you know what? It was still enjoyable. We had a blast. Adventures like this allowed game masters and players of any skill level to create and play in the manner most enjoyable to them. Of course, looking back on it now, I see Legion of Gold's lost potential and can imagine it as part of a much larger campaign setting with detailed world building, which is exactly what I plan to do when I eventually turn this into a Mutant Crawl Classics adventure for my gaming groups. Updating and expanding on it wouldn't even be the first time. WotC's 2011 version was published for 7th edition Game World, and it expanded on the original story with a stronger narrative. I will be including material from that 7th edition as part of my MCC conversion. But regardless of if it's 30 pages or 250, the only thing that matters is whether you enjoy the game while playing it. If you look at the Temple of Elemental Evil on Dungeon Masters Guild, there's only a very small number of bad reviews, and they can pretty much be summed up with, "Oh no, I had to use my own imagination and create stuff. This sucks. Don't buy this product. It's a waste of your time." Blah. And that might be an example of how different the expectations are between new gamers and those from the 80s. In the 80s, we were encouraged to engage our own imaginations. With new books, you're encouraged to follow their roadmap. In all fairness, maybe the people who hate Temple of Elemental Evil really do need the big hardbound books, so I can't say it's all bad. But I would encourage you to exercise your own creativity to most benefit the ever-changing needs of your games. Did you know back in the very beginning days of the hobby, Gygax and company didn't even think that publishing adventures would be profitable, assuming everyone would want to create their own? And though I'm not sure about the younger generation of players now, you'll certainly find that older gamers would rarely ever run an adventure that did not include massive expansions to and changes of the source material. Personally, I hope the newer players embrace that as well, if you haven't already. So problem number one, as I see it, is new DMs might be setting themselves up for failure if they allow all of those unrealistic self-imposed expectations to burden them and get some idea there's a right way and a wrong way to play the published adventures.
Learn this 250-page adventure and play exactly like Matt Mercer or your game sucks!
But that's just not true. You don't need to have everything laid out for you. You don't need to follow any published adventure the way it was written. If a player gets upset that you changed the adventure from how it was published, they already know too much about it. And that's a them problem more than a you problem. Our hobby needs more game masters. The DM crisis is real, and it isn't new. If DMing sounds appealing, then I hope you pursue that because the hobby needs you. And in the long run, the rewards are well worth it. Now, frankly, there are some people who just don't have the right personality for it. That's not a failure on their part, and I'm not criticizing their efforts. It's just the reality that DMing can involve some traits not found in everyone. Interpersonal skills are very important, but the good news is in many cases, those skills can be learned. If you have a passion for the hobby, if you love being creative, if you can be extremely patient, and you can make it through more than 6 minutes of a D&D YouTube video, then you can learn the leadership skills necessary to have enjoyable experiences refereeing literally any tabletop role-playing game. And the interpersonal skills, the leadership skills you learn from playing a TTRPG can benefit every aspect of your life. I've made videos about that too. What you need most, more than anything else, is something that can't necessarily be taught. It's something you either have or you don't. And that's a deep passion for the hobby. You're gonna need a passion for the hobby so intense that your friends will be secretly wondering,
Maybe we should be finding you some professional help.
but that's okay because we are all a little weird. So it is passion. Passion is the most important trait new and even experienced DMs need in order to be successful. You're doing your best and that's appreciated. If you have a player who doesn't respect that, then maybe have a talk with them privately. See if maybe you can resolve the issue or replace them. Finding new players that do appreciate your efforts, it's not too difficult. And with virtual games now available, anyone with an internet connection who wants to be playing D&D should be able to find an opportunity to play D&D. I use Fantasy Grounds as my virtual tabletop. I'm doing a video about that in the future. I've also just been contacted by another VTT looking for my group to review the product. Stay tuned for that as well. If you find yourself struggling with a frustrated player, that might simply be a test of your leadership skills. Don't take it personally. And if you haven't already learned this, listen to constructive criticism and decide if they have a point or if they don't. You'll find some people just like to complain and create controversy where none needed to exist. You can just tune that stuff out. But sometimes you'll learn something from that criticism and be able to see things from a perspective our little confirmation bias blinders might have prevented us from being aware of. When people talk about their games, they often speak of them as if they themselves were personally there undertaking those journeys. This is a testament to the fantastic positive psychological healing benefits of these games. They can bring us out of our reality for fantastic adventures. Another thing I want new players to consider is when you hear someone say a particular adventure is better suited for more experienced game masters, that advice might not be objectively true. I think I've been guilty of that, and it's something I try to avoid saying because it's misleading advice. To say some published adventures are best for experienced game masters might be creating an unnecessary wall. I still think a 250-page adventure is too much responsibility for a new DM, and some adventures are just less complicated overall, but ultimately a fear of not being able to run an adventure correctly shouldn't stop you from trying, since there really isn't a right or wrong way. As we just discussed, you'll simply be playing a different version of that adventure than a much more experienced DM. But so long as everyone enjoys themselves, then the game you're playing is the right one. I do, however, recommend those new to the hobby look for short adventure modules like those you'll find in anthology books or PDFs on DM's Guild and Drive-Thru-RPG. You will not have the burden of some huge overarching monstrosity that puts a bunch of expectations on you. And with those longer adventures, you're in many ways being deprived of the creativity that makes this hobby so enjoyable. If you really want a finished story, giving you all the answers before your first session, then you really don't need to spend $50 on a big WotC adventure. You could just copy any book, movie, or TV show, change a bunch of the names, and still be able to flex your own imagination.
Final tips.
Every published adventure should only be a foundation to work from. What you do with it is up to you. Change as much as you want. Every game table will run every adventure differently. Even the same DM will run the same adventure differently in response to player choices. Which leads me to my next tip. You need to find your own unique voice. You have one, and it may be a process, but you'll find it if you haven't already. Mine is still evolving, and you should have the same freedom. I have always had some players who leaned more heavily into characterization and role-playing, while others have enjoyed the mechanics and tactical challenges of combat encounters. Don't be fooled into thinking any one style of play is superior to another. Enjoy and embrace the differences. And remember, you're not playing D&D to win D&D, not in the traditional sense. If you want to win D&D, then play a video game. Play a video game inspired by it, or, play that card game, the one. Or play literally any other competitive game. In a TTRPG, the only person that you're competing with is yourself. Which I mean is, every time I play any TTRPG, I win when I've improved my understanding of the game, expanded my own creative horizons, and my friends and I have enjoyed our time together. While there may be elements of competition within the game world, the true essence of playing these games lies in the collaborative creativity and growth that comes from each session. With TTRPGs, success isn't even necessarily about defeating enemies or achieving specific objectives, but rather about the shared experience, the bonds formed with fellow players, and the imaginative worlds explored together. Each session offers opportunities for players to learn, adapt, and contribute to the collective narrative, fostering a sense of camaraderie and shared accomplishment. Game masters should never have an adversarial me versus them attitude. All TTRPGs are basically just math games with all the math problems dressed up like monsters and heroes. Really, that's it. I'm sorry to break the illusion, but really that's all they are. And if you want to run a DM versus the player type of game, save your trouble because you've already won. You already have dozens of books filled with hundreds of monsters that could end the game in one session. So just save yourself the effort, declare yourself the winner, and go home. Likewise, players are not served by having a player versus the rules mindset either. Those types used to be called rules lawyers, and they still exist today, but I've seen a troubling evolution in modern gaming where this view of gaming leads some people to spend hours theory crafting and trying to create unbeatable exploit builds. Sure, get the most out of your build. Look for the best options. Min-maxing isn't a new thing, but extensive, unrestrained theory crafting and rules bending can lead you far, far astray from what makes TTRPGs enjoyable over an extended period of time. I'm not sorry to say the coffee lock isn't coming to my table. People can power game, people can play exploit builds. You do you, but I think those people are going to get a lot more out of just playing a video game. If you think about it, a superhero is not defined by their strengths. They're defined by their weaknesses. And if you want to create an unbeatable character, why even play? Is a game even a game if there's no chance of losing? 5th edition D&D already suffers from this lack of risk. Why make it worse? Frankly, I still DM and run my games not much differently than I did when I was playing AD&D in the 80s and 90s. Despite my experience, I still occasionally need to ask my players for their input, which means that you can too. This goes back to the collaborative nature of D&D. The only real hard line here is that when the DM makes their final ruling, that's the end of the discussion, at least until after the game session's conclusion. Then later you can debate it and decide if it needs to be done differently next time. So I just said a lot of stuff to make this larger point. With the hindsight of over 40 years as a Dungeon Master, I have found that none of my past experiences make the game more enjoyable today than when I knew nothing about it. Talking about years of experience is actually just a debate tactic that's considered a logical fallacy. It's an appeal to authority, and it proves nothing if the information isn't useful for you. The imaginative ideas of a veteran player are no more or less valuable than those of a new one. Just like the clout chasers are telling you about celebrity DM secrets, none of it matters. I had just as much fun, maybe even more at times, when I was new to the hobby. In the past couple of years, I've been supplementing my 5e campaign with a few published adventures from the 80s. I'm running them much differently than I did back when I was a teenager, but neither style is objectively better or worse. Being new to TTRPGs shouldn't be making it less enjoyable. If you're feeling frustrated or overwhelmed, that's probably because you or some others are placing expectations on you that aren't necessary or realistic. You're not competing with Matt Mercer. He's an entertainer playing for an audience. I made a video on that topic that you should definitely watch after this one. If you're new to this wonderful hobby, then it's my hope that you'll find the same enjoyment that I have found over these years. And that's why I make these videos. Uploading them is a labor of love, and it brings me immense joy when I hear they've been helpful to you. So I'm grateful, very, very grateful when I hear that. Now, as always, I'm your host, Atten, here at We Love TTRPGs, and I appreciate your support by liking the video and sharing your thoughts in the comments. It really helps with the algorithm, and we're just starting to finally maybe get some of these videos out there with people watching them, and I'm really grateful for that. Thank you very much.
Oh no, I haven't used my imagination.